And so the real test of whether you support something or not is when it really mattered. And the Labor Party and Anthony Albanese opposed all of those measures for so long, and they demonised those. They demonised those who sought to put them in place. Yeah, look, I've already answered the question. No, the right response was to ensure that the Minister for the Pacific, we were very aware of where that agreement was up to, as were all other Pacific leaders. It was very important that we communicated very clearly to the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands, Manasseh Sogavare, what the Australian government's position was. And to do that at that level made very clear that Australia was not looking to go and stamp around, that we were going to deal constructively and respectfully. That is...
even work. She's the foreign minister.
At a different level to the Minister for Pacific. One is in cabinet, one is not. You calibrate your diplomacy to deal with sensitive issues.
Why is this not important enough for a cabinet minister?
Because, as I said before, in the Pacific, one of the things you've got to be very, very cognisant of is there is a long history of, frankly, countries like Australia and even New Zealand and others coming around and treating Pacific Islands like they should be doing what the big countries should tell them to do. That is what... No, hang on. You've asked me the question about why this is important. Now, I've had a lot of experience in this area and I've dealt with Pacific countries for a long time, including before I went into Parliament. One of the things you don't do in the Pacific is you don't throw your weight around. What you do is you treat others respectfully and you ensure... Look, I'm very conscious of how visits are perceived within the Pacific. This was the right calibrated way to address this issue with the Prime Minister. I've had discussions with the Prime Minister personally about these issues. I've spoken to Manasseh on many occasions, many occasions, as I talk to Pacific leaders all the time, and particularly about this issue. So the judgment was made not to engage in a more, at a foreign minister level engagement, to ensure that Australia's views were communicated very clearly and very respectfully, and that has been done. And this is an ongoing issue. This is an ongoing issue. That secret agreement, the Solomon Islands Prime Minister was very determined to resolve it. There is a lot of influence going on in the Pacific, and there is a lot of pressure being placed on other Pacific countries around our region. And what they need to understand is that I am going to work with them. I'm not going to act like former administrations that treated the Pacific like some extension of Australia. The Pacific Islands are very sensitive to that. And I've always had an approach with the Pacific Islands which understands those sensitivities because there is a lot at stake.
No one's arguing. The point that this hasn't come as a surprise. How were you informed that the deal was finalised? Have you spoken to Manasseh Sogavare in the last 24 hours? And given that you say this has been an ongoing issue, doesn't that just show Australia has become complacent and that China has done a better job on the diplomatic front?
No, I don't think you can draw that conclusion. I think, again, what this highlights is that over the last 5 years in particular, the level of interference and the level of engagement, and particularly, with all sorts of promises of all sorts of investments, that can be very persuasive. And so that is the challenge that we're now dealing with, and we've been dealing with it for many years. It is not a new issue, and these threats still remain. I speak to other Pacific leaders about it all the time, and what we reassure them about, and you can't always be fully persuasive on these issues. What I assure them about is that Australia will be there for you as we always are, not because we want anything from you, but because we see the Pacific as our family and we want to stand by our family and ensure that they can have the sovereignty that they have earned, that they believe in very strongly, and we want to support them in that. And so the Solomon Islands government, through a duly elected Prime Minister and a cabinet, have made a decision that they are allowed to make. Of course they are. They're a sovereign country, and we have to respect their sovereignty. And so now with this arrangement, we need to ensure we work with them to see that Australia's obvious interests aren't compromised, because we believe that in our interests, that their strength and their sovereignty is not compromised by these types of arrangements. And that's why I sent the national security officials to go and provide a briefing to the Prime Minister, as I did to a number of other leaders in the region. Now, I can't go into the reasons as to why I I'm aware of whether agreements have been reached or not. That is not appropriate in terms of how the Australian government operates.
No one's arguing.
Okay.